Mass protests are breaking out in several regions of China this month. They're driven by a number of grievances, and angry Chinese protesters have been seen clashing with police officers.
The fact that they won't even give their economic data out anymore, what does that really tell you about the shape of their economy right now when you've got protests happening at their factories across the country? That says to me uprising is coming, to be
uprising is not only coming, it's also here. It's not just the workers, it's also bank depositors right now. Chinese economy is contracting. We see this from the price data for February, March, and April. The country's in a deflationary spiral. That's an economy killer.
China is facing an unprecedented financial catastrophe that could reshape the global economy forever. From empty government offices where civil servants haven't been paid in months, to elderly investors crying in the streets after losing their life savings. The signs are everywhere. China's total debt has exploded to well over $50 trillion. That's more than 3 times what the entire country earns in a year. To put that in perspective, it's as if your debt were triple your income, with no realistic path to paying it off. What makes this crisis truly terrifying is that behind every figure is real pain. Government workers are maxing out credit cards just to survive. Retirees who trusted government-backed bonds have lost everything. And local governments are so broke, they're being banned from using high-speed trains because they can't pay their debts. Here's the real story of how China's massive debt load grew so massive, why it's collapsing now, and what this means for the rest of the world. By the end of this special report, you'll understand why this isn't just China's problem, it's everyone's problem. Here are the jaw-dropping numbers. China's total debt, including government, corporate, and household debt, now exceeds $50 trillion. That is larger than the entire GDP of the United States and European Union combined. But here's what makes it even scarier. This debt has been growing at breakneck speed. Just half a decade ago, China's debt-to-GDP ratio was around 2.5 times its economic output. Today, it's over 3 times GDP and climbing every single day. For comparison, the United States, which everyone says has a debt problem, sits at roughly 2.75 times its GDP. Japan, famous for its debt issues, is at similar levels. China has blown past both of these supposedly debt-heavy nations. What's particularly alarming is where this debt is concentrated. Local governments alone owe over $12 trillion through official channels, but experts estimate the real number could be closer to $18 to $20 trillion when you include hidden debts. That's money borrowed through shadow financing vehicles that don't show up on official government books. The property sector, which was supposed to be China's golden goose, has become a massive liability. Real estate companies owe hundreds of billions, with giants like Evergrande owing between $290 billion and $310 billion. And Country Garden owing close to $190 billion. When these companies started collapsing, they took down entire supply chains with them. To understand this crisis, we need to go back to the 1990s when local governments discovered what seemed like a gold mine, selling land to property developers. Back then, this looked brilliant. Cities could fund infrastructure projects simply by selling land rights. Developers could build apartments for China's growing urban population, and it was a win-win situation, or so it seemed to be. You see, by the 2000s, land sales had become addictive for local governments. Instead of building diverse revenue sources through taxation, they became heavily dependent on this one-time cash injection. In some regions, nearly 2/5 of city budgets relied on land deals by the early 2020s. They were essentially running their cities like real estate companies. Then came the late 2000s financial crisis, and China's response changed everything. Beijing launched a massive stimulus plan, pouring trillions into the economy and telling local governments to borrow and spend their way out of trouble. This created a dangerous pattern. Whenever the economy slowed, the solution was always more borrowing and more spending. Local governments couldn't borrow directly due to regulations, so they created special financing vehicles, essentially shadow companies that could take out loans without appearing on official government books. These vehicles were everywhere, allowing local governments to borrow billions to build new cities, highways, and infrastructure projects. By the mid-2010s, local government debt had reached approximately $6 trillion, much of it backed by future land sales. The logic was simple. As long as property prices kept rising and land sales kept flowing, the debts could be repaid. But this strategy rested on financial assumptions that couldn't hold up under pressure. The first major crack appeared around 2019 to 2020 when Beijing introduced the 3 red lines policy to limit how much debt property developers could take on. The government saw a housing bubble forming, tried to cool things down, but instead of a soft landing, this triggered a crash. Property developers who had been borrowing heavily suddenly couldn't access new loans. When home sales slowed, they didn't have enough cash to pay their bills. Evergrande, once China's second largest developer, filed for bankruptcy in early 2021. Country Garden narrowly avoided default in late 2023 by making some last-minute payments. But those ripple effects were immediate, and those ripple effects were devastating. Land sales, which local governments depended on for 2/5 of their revenue, dropped by nearly half almost overnight. In recent years, land sales fell another 12 to 15% nationally, some provinces like Henan seeing drops of over 30%. Certainly, local governments in China found themselves in an impossible situation. They had borrowed heavily, using future land sales as collateral, but now there were no land sales to back up those loans. It's like taking out a mortgage based on a salary that you no longer had. Behind these massive numbers are real people facing real hardship. Take the civil servants who studied for years to pass competitive exams for stable government jobs, only to find themselves unpaid for months. One government worker in Guizhou province said, "After spending 3 years preparing for civil service examinations, I've now discovered I'm basically doing unpaid work for the state." In some cities, close to 90 million public sector employees are struggling to get paid. Performance bonuses have been cancelled across the board. In worst cases, salaries have been delayed for several months. Some government workers are maxing out credit cards, taking online loans just to pay their mortgages and car payments. The situation has become so desperate that some local governments are borrowing money just to pay salaries. In one shocking case, a hospital demanded that doctors repay performance bonuses and night shift pay from the past 5 years because the local government could no longer afford them. But it's not just government workers who are suffering. The Xi'an Jinggu Treasury bond scandal shows how this crisis is devastating ordinary citizens. This government-affiliated bond service provider defaulted on Treasury bonds, causing hundreds of elderly investors to completely lose their life savings. I witnessed these protests firsthand. Elderly citizens, some in their 80s and 90s, were literally crying in the streets after learning that bonds they thought were government guaranteed had become worthless. One elderly man in his late 80s who had collected scraps for years to save around $25,000 all of which he invested in these bonds, is now begging for food outside government buildings. The debt crisis extends far beyond official government borrowing into China's massive shadow banking system worth close to $3 trillion. These are unofficial lenders offering high-risk, high-reward investments, often tied to real estate projects that are now failing. When Changxi Enterprise Group, China's largest asset management firm, collapsed in late 2023, it left over 150,000 high net worth investors holding completely worthless investments. The company admitted it was deeply insolvent, with debts exceeding $28 to $32 billion. Then there's the P2P, the peer-to-peer lending sector, which has virtually collapsed after years of widespread fraud. More than $100 billion in investor funds remain unrecovered, leaving countless victims with absolutely nothing. Rural banks in Henan province froze withdrawals without warning, affecting over 400,000 depositors and approximately $5 to $6 billion in funds. When people protested, authorities cracked down hard, with some protesters being detained and others reporting harassment and intimidation. This debt crisis is creating a devastating chain reaction throughout China's economy. Banks that lent billions to property developers and local governments are now holding loans that may never be repaid. The Industrial and Commercial Bank of China alone lent close to $70 billion to railway projects that are losing money every year. With banks nervous about further lending, businesses across China are struggling to get credit. Construction spending fell by roughly a quarter in recent years. Unemployment in cities hit around 5%, and consumer spending remains very weak as people worry about their financial future. Well, the government has tried to address this by issuing around $65 to $70 billion in special sovereign bonds to boost bank capital, but experts say this amounts to minor surgery on a massive structural problem. The fundamental problems remain unresolved. China's debt crisis isn't just a domestic problem, it's a global threat. As the world's second-largest economy and manufacturing hub, China's financial troubles affect everyone. If Chinese factories shut down or cut back production due to credit constraints, global supply chains will be disrupted. Countries that export raw materials to China, like Australia and Brazil, will see demand drop. Nations that rely on Chinese investment through the Belt and Road Initiative may find themselves with unfinished infrastructure projects and no way at all to repay their loans. Financial markets worldwide are also at risk. International investors, including pension funds from the United States and Europe, have poured billions into Chinese real estate and bonds. If these investments go bad, the losses will spread far beyond China's borders. Beijing is trying to desperately manage this crisis without triggering a complete collapse. In recent years, they issued over $400 billion in special bonds to help local governments refinance their debt. They've also raised the deficit ceiling to roughly 4% of GDP, representing a significant increase from previous years, showing just how serious the situation has become. The central government is forcing banks to lend more by lowering interest rates and providing extra liquidity. They're also trying to revive the property market by easing restrictions and lowering mortgage rates, though these efforts have had limited success. Local governments are being forced to find new revenue sources since land sales are no longer reliable. Some are resorting to aggressive tax collection and fee increases, putting additional pressure on businesses and residents who are already struggling. The core issue is that China's entire economic model has been built on ever-increasing debt and asset bubbles. For decades, the solution to every economic problem has been more borrowing and more spending, but you can't borrow your way to prosperity forever. Chinese economist Zhang Xiaolong explains it perfectly. Major state-owned banks have long been forced to bleed cash to support monopolistic industrial conglomerates, while local commercial banks are bleeding cash to local governments. These behaviors have turned local governments and state-run firms into super debtors with no fear of default. When one bond matures, another is issued for an even larger amount. Banks are forced to buy in, creating an endless debt spiral that simply drains depositors' savings into the state's coffers, never to be returned. The question isn't whether China will face a major financial crisis, it's when and how severe it will be. Some experts predict that, without dramatic action, close to 1/3 of China's provinces could face budget defaults by the late 2020s. The government has some advantages. Most debt is owed internally to Chinese banks rather than to foreign creditors, giving them a little more control. They also have over $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves that could be used in emergencies. But these advantages may not be enough. The debt burden is simply too large, growing too fast, and affecting too many parts of the economy simultaneously. Real estate, local governments, shadow banking, and state-owned enterprises are all interconnected in a web of debt that's becoming impossible to untangle. China's $55 trillion debt crisis represents one of the largest financial bubbles in human history, and it's finally starting to burst. From unpaid civil servants to elderly investors losing their life savings, the human cost is already devastating. Behind every figure is real pain. It's about a fundamental breakdown in China's economic model that has relied on ever-increasing debt for growth. The fallout of this process is rippling through global markets, from disrupted supply chains to falling investor confidence. Whether China can manage this crisis without triggering a global recession remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the days of debt-fueled growth are certainly over, and the reckoning has begun. Keep watching this space, because China's next moves could determine not just their economic future, but the financial stability of the entire world. The massive debt load that seemed so impressive when it was being built is now threatening to bury everything underneath it. And sadly, the world may soon feel the weight of that collapse. Thank you for watching.